Hello, everyone, and welcome to StatsTree. This site is all about statistics, so I thought I'd start by talking about what statistics is. A couple of years ago, I was teaching a class in statistics, and on the first day, I asked students to write down the word that first came to mind when they thought of statistics. And you'll see that the number one word that pops out is math. But surprisingly, statistics doesn't actually involve all that much math. There's some addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and maybe a little bit of algebra. But beyond that, statistics isn't all that mathy. If you take a closer look at this word cloud, though, you're going to see some words that are a little bit worrying. Words like ooh and pain, no, and some grumpy faces. And that's because for many students, statistics are intimidating, maybe even boring, and many students aren't really sure why they're required to learn about statistics. So some of what I feel like my job is here with this site is to try and present some material to help you better understand statistics, but to do it in a way that is interesting and engaging. So first of all, what is statistics, or what are statistics? Is statistics even plural or singular? Well, actually it can be both. So we can think of statistics in the plural sense as a set of numbers that we might use to describe a particular situation. Think of baseball statistics like ERA or batting average. We use these to just provide a description of something. But statistics is also a scientific or mathematical field that's concerned with data collection, presentation, analysis, and interpretation. Another way you might think of statistics then is the tool that scientists use to make decisions when there's uncertainty. Now, not all scientific questions involve some uncertainty about the answer. For example, what is the function of the chloroplast? Or how many amino acids are there? What do you get when you squish together two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom? How many species of squirrels are there in Colorado, or is there life on Mars? These are all scientific questions that, although we might not know the answer to them, or maybe science doesn't even yet know the answer to some of these questions, but once we know the answer, we will know it with some certainty. But there are some questions for which we can never really know the answer with complete certainty. So for example, how many pine trees are there in Colorado? It's simply not possible to go out and count every single individual tree in the state of Colorado. Now, some of you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, if I had enough money and enough time, I could go through all of Colorado and count every single tree. And maybe some of you might even think that would be a fun thing to do as a summer job, or maybe to spend the next 10 years doing that. But in addition to being not practical, there are also situations in which it's simply not possible. So for example, I've been interested in this invasive species, a little zooplankton called Bythotrephes, or the spiny water flea. It's like other water fleas, like Daphnia, in many ways, except it's got this big, long, nasty tail spine out the back of it. Now, these little things are living in freshwater lakes in North America, reproducing, letting go of live young every couple of weeks, and constantly being eaten by fish. And so if we were to try and count the number of individuals in a particular lake, we'd face this challenge that that number is constantly changing because new individuals are being born and individuals are constantly dying. So even if we did try and catch every single one in the lake, the number that are in the lake at any one point in time is not going to stay the same. So how might we then estimate how many Bythotrephes are in a particular lake, let's say Fairy Lake? Well, the solution is that we sample. We can't measure everything, so we measure a subset of things and use that sample to create a best guess. So for example, we might consider Fairy Lake as the entity that we wanted to try and understand and how many Bythotrephes are in it. Now, Fairy Lake is a reasonable size, about 6.6 million meters squared. We're not going to be able to drag a net through all of it. So let's say we go out with a net that's about 0.2 meters squared in size. We go out in a boat to 10 different places on the lake, and in each of those places, we drop the net down toward the bottom, pull it back up again, and count how many Bythotrephes are in the net. So let's say we do this 10 times, and on average, there's about 50 Bythotrephes in each of those net pulls. Now here's where we need to do a little bit of math, but it's not that tough. If there's 50 Bythotrephes on average in 0.2 meters squared of the lake, and the entire lake is 6.6 million meters squared, we can calculate that there's about 1.7 billion Bythotrephes in this lake. So let's think about that number for a minute. Is this a reasonable estimate? This 1.7 billion is the best information that we've got. It's probably not the exact right number, but it's the best information that we have from the sample that we collected. The second thing to consider is whether or not this number might be consistently too high or too low. That is, that it might be biased. There are potentially some parts of the lake where it's hard to get a boat, and so maybe we didn't sample in those locations, and maybe those tend to have more or less Bythotrephes. And so as a result, we might consistently overestimate or underestimate the true number, and that's referred to as bias. But in addition to bias, there's also just uncertainty about what the real number is that comes from just chance. If we drop our net down 10 times anywhere in the lake, we might get 1.7 billion one day. And if we did it in slightly different locations, we might calculate that it's 1.6 billion. And the bottom line is that 1.7 billion is almost surely not the exact right number. It's our best guess, but we probably have a fair bit of uncertainty about how close it actually might be to the true number. And statistics then provides us with a tool to measure and account for uncertainty in our estimates. So before we go too far, let's go over some definitions that we've already talked about. A population in a statistical sense is the entire collection of things that you're interested in or what you want to draw your conclusions about. So in this particular example, the population that we are interested in is all of the Bythotrephes in Fairy Lake. Now, this statistical population may or may not correspond to a biological population. We might be interested in trying to understand individuals or ecosystems or communities or individual genes or organelles. And so our statistical population could be at any of those biological levels, not necessarily corresponding to a biological population. So for example, we might be interested in all of the wetlands in North Dakota, or all of the places where two species of chickadees live together, or all of the genes in the sunflower genome. The second bit of terminology that we have to work through is the sample. The sample is the subset of things from the population that you actually measured. So in our example, our statistical sample was our 10 net pulls that we collected from Fairy Lake. So in terms of our other examples then, our samples might be 12 of the wetlands in North Dakota, 22 of the different locations where chickadees co-occur, or perhaps 32 of all of the possible genes in the sunflower genome. Now, before we get too far, we need to clarify a potential point of confusion. And that is the difference between a biological sample and a statistical sample. Biologists often use the term sample to refer to a single entity that they have measured. So think about a soil sample, or a water sample, or an air sample. The thing that you've measured or taken from the ground or the air. But this does not correspond to a statistical sample. A statistical sample is the collection of all of the things together that you measured. So let's take this researcher, for example, who's interested in the age and growth rates of trees in a forest. And so the researcher collects some tree cores, let's say 10 different tree cores, to try and estimate the age of trees in a particular forest stand. So in this case, the statistical sample represents all 10 cores together as a single sample, rather than each of those cores representing a single biological sample. So that's the difference between a biological sample and a statistical sample. So we're interested in a population. We can't measure everything in that population, so we measure a subset of entities from that population called a statistical sample. From each of those entities, we measure something that we then want to calculate or use to draw conclusions about our population. And this is what's called an estimate. It's what you calculated from your sample. So in our case, our estimate was the 1.7 billion Bythotrephes in Fairy Lake that we wanted to use to draw conclusions about our population. The thing in the population that we want to draw conclusions about is referred to as the parameter. It's the quantity describing the population that you want to know about. So in this example, our parameter was the number of Bythotrephes in Fairy Lake, and this can never be known with certainty because we can't measure everything. So instead, we infer what that true parameter is from our estimate, which comes from the sample. So we have a population that we want to try and draw some conclusions about or measure something called a parameter. We can't measure everything in that population to know what the true parameter actually is. So instead, we measure a subset of entities through a process called sampling. From that sample, we calculate an estimate, which is our best guess of what the true population parameter actually is. So in summary then, in many cases in biology, we can't measure all of the things that we want to make our conclusions about. So instead, what we do is we sample. We measure only a subset of the entities that are present in the population. We use our sample to calculate an estimate, which is our best guess of what the true population parameter actually is. But because we didn't measure everything in the population, we have some uncertainty about what that true parameter is. Our estimate is our best guess, but we don't really know for sure. And statistics then represents the tool that lets us measure things and make inferences from samples when we have uncertainty about what true population parameters are. So that is the end of our first video. If you feel like you understand things well, you can move on to the next material. If you're still having trouble understanding the material, you can rewatch this video as much as you'd like, or access some of the additional resources present on the website.